Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and Ray.
Yo.
And we are joined today for the second time by Mark Bray, our good friend of the show.
Hey, everyone.
And, Hey there, Mark. How you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure. I know I promised that, next time you came, we'd have more callers lined up, but, man, I couldn't.
Silent.
I couldn't find enough, enough people in the Midwest who had strong opinions about.
You got to do a free T-shirt giveaway.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I can put on my best Catalan accent or something.
Yeah. We're talking about Mark's newest book, The Anarchist Inquisition: Assassins, Activists, and Martyrs in Spain and France, and this is from this year. And I think it's on Cornell University Press. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So this is, just to really briefly give my own introduction to this work, but then we're gonna let you give your own.
You go ahead and give yours.
All right. So this is, the scope of this book is really, really massive, even though it doesn't cover many years. It's a really complex cross section of, I would say, the anarchist scene in Spain, France, and the UK, Italy, right? And how a lot of the attention at the time was drawn towards events going on, particularly in Spain, around certain trials, anarchist laws, repression, torture, that kind of thing. But also this was a time of the propaganda of the deed for not just for anarchists, but also for anarchists, and the sort of moral questions and political results, I guess, or maybe even lack of them, that came out of this period. I've long been fascinated by this period. It's very colorful, it's very dramatic. There's lots of big characters and figures in it, kind of larger than life stories of revolutionaries and so on. And it's hard not to be really fascinated by sort of the color and drama of all of it. But also, it's always been interesting to me to see where these tactics went. How did they kind of co-constitute what we call today anarchism, but also how they reflected what results, how do I put this? What effect they had on the developing modern state as well, and the police state and so on. And I got to say, this looks like a lot of work. Many years obviously went into this, and I don't think there's ever going to need to be another book on this topic, Mark. I think you have somehow utterly exhausted future research routes into this period. So well done.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and I did work off. There have been a lot of people a lot of scholars who have taken chunks of this.
Yes.
Right. But yeah, it's at least in terms of the history of anarchism in Spain, this turn to the 20th century period has often been referred to the period that's gotten the least attention, because you've certainly obviously gotten more around the era of the Spanish Revolution.
Right.
You certainly got more around the era of the First International. This era has gotten less attention. The era of the propaganda by the deed is known, but what I sort of tried to do with this book is certainly flesh all that out, but look at it through the lens of the campaigns that it generated in support of those imprisoned and tortured and so forth by the Spanish state, how it generated those campaigns, how it actually, I would argue, played a role in some of those campaigns, and how the public perception of propaganda by the deed, even beyond anarchist circles, was a little bit more varied than I think a lot of readers today would imagine.
Yeah.
And my kind of academic angle, because I wrote this came out of my dissertation, was thinking through the history of human rights in terms of how anarchists of that era framed their politics theoretically, and how they mobilized them practically in coalition with non-anarchists, and even in some cases some conservatives. And yeah, but above and beyond everything else, though, I really just wanted to tell a lot of engrossing, engaging stories. I want it to be something that's fun and interesting to read, and but it is also an academic book, so hopefully it kind of manages to have one foot in both worlds.
Yeah, it really does. It's easy to get. I mean, there's so many stories in this book that cross into each other, and they're all really engrossing. And surprising. I mean, the human rights angle we'll talk about, that was really interesting. But also, I would say the global scope of the solidarity campaigns around the events we're going to talk about crossed colonial borders. It connected people of vastly different backgrounds and even politics together. And it's really fascinating to see just the sheer scope of it all, really, in this period. But Mark, why is it called the Anarchist Inquisition?
Yeah. Again, to kind of summarize for people that are just learning about this, the basic constellation of events in the book is anarchists committed assassinations or blew stuff up. In response, the Spanish state, to a lesser extent, the French state, arrested, imprisoned, and tortured a lot of people, anarchists and otherwise. And in response to that, there were these transnational solidarity campaigns to get people out of prison, right? That's the sort of the three main chunks. And I call it the Anarchist Inquisition because the rhetorical motif used by these campaigns to demonize the Spanish state was to call it a revival of the Inquisition. And this, of course, had power in the context of the legacy of the Black legend, right? The Black legend being this notion that Spanish colonial atrocities were far more brutal, allegedly, than those committed by the British or French or whatever, which, that they were all brutal, right? But there was this legacy dating from Las Casas and the early era of Spanish colonialism. But what's interesting that I talk about in the book is that the term wasn't coined until the beginning of the 20th century in this media environment, and grew out in part from these campaigns, right? This notion that connecting Spanish brutality at the turn of the 20th century with Spanish brutality from Columbus onward. So that was how they talked about this revival of the Inquisition. And so I kind of made it the Anarchist Inquisition because in a sense it was anarchists were the victims, and they were also kind of the authors of this notion by mobilizing this motif of Spanish inquisitorial brutality to demonize the state. So they sort of existed on both sides of this. And I thought it had a good ring to it. And the publisher, Cornell University Press, they did the subtitle, and I said, I don't really care what the subtitle is, but I want that as the title.
Nice. I want to say at this point to listeners that Mark also recently did an interview on the podcast of some other friends of the show, some Aussies who have a show called Yana Passaran. And I wanted to make sure we didn't necessarily just repeat that interview. So if listeners are curious about, other sides of the story and other details, I definitely suggest you check out Yana Passaran, because there's no way to cover this book in one interview. It would take dozens, I think, realistically, to really exhaust this thing. Let's get into it. So let's start, I guess, with a really broad and general question for our listenership. I'd say anywhere between a lot of to maybe even most of our listeners are probably not that intimately acquainted with anarchism, especially in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century period. So I figure it might help to start with the very basics here. What did anarchism mean to, let's say, the Spanish proletariat, French, Italian, we'll say, that kind of connected group of the late 19th century? What did it mean to them then? Yeah,
I mean, again, that could be its own subject, but to sort of get into it kind of briefly, I would argue that it's useful to see the development of the organized anarchist movement, particularly from the 1870s onward, as an offshoot from the debates in the First International, which grouped together Marxists and anarchists and other kinds of socialists about several key issues, one of which was the electoral struggle. Anarchists rejected the electoral struggle and argued that revolution was the only way to overthrow capitalism. Another issue that divided them from other kinds of socialists was the state. They argued that the state, as a hierarchical body of organized violence, was inherently repressive, whether or not it was commanded by workers or the bourgeoisie or whoever. And so they were anti-state, they were anti-electoral revolutionaries, which differed from at least in the short term, from the classical Marxist take on how to transform society. Another key aspect of it, which present day people may not take into account to the same degree, at least in the United States, is they were also very strong anti-clericals.
Yeah.
They thought that they held up like religion, capital, and the state as the three-headed monster they were battling, which also goes to show you how issues of racism and sexism and so forth were there, but weren't, as far as Western European anarchists, elevated to the same level of importance in a lot of their rhetoric as capital, state, and the church. And this plays a key role in several developments in this book, which we may talk about later, such as the Tragic Week, which became enormous anti-clerical rebellion. But largely, I would argue that anarchism in Western Europe and in the late 19th century was a predominantly working class movement that, in the context of Spain particularly, saw the electoral system as illegitimate, in part because compared to even France or the UK, it was far less representative of what everyday people wanted and need. I mean, we could use terms like corruption, which I think often obscure structural issues, but it also was a very corrupt system as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a worker or a campesino in Spain, the notion that, hey, these elections are a fraud was a pretty easy sell.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, and of course, the society was super controlled by the church. So the notion that the church was oppressive, an easy sell. Mm-hmm. And so you can see the kind of context in which this politics develops. It fits the constraints of the prevailing economic, political, and kind of religious system.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that the Corpus Christi bombing, which I have here in 1896 in Barcelona, that this sort of acts as the initial trigger mechanism for your overall narrative?
Yeah.
So maybe
talk about it.
Yes, please.
Right.
What the hell was that? And how did the anarchists in particular sort of take it on and be impacted by it?
Yeah. So to take a brief step back, anarchists developed this notion of propaganda by the deed in the late 19th century, which was essentially targeted, acts of violence against symbolic figures of authority like presidents or kings or major capitalists or what have you. And it became a really big deal in the 1890s across Europe and the Americas and beyond. President McKinley was assassinated, the king of Italy. Right. There's a lot of examples. And so it was outside of like Russia in the context of the first Russian Revolution and examples like that. It was the biggest in Spain numerically and in terms of people who were killed by it and so forth. And in the early 1890s, there were several high-profile bombings, which caused the Spanish state to arrest more and more people, charge more and more people as being part of the kind of alleged anarchist conspiracy without evidence that was the case. If anything, it seemed more like this was the work of individuals or small groups. But in 1896, everything kind of hit a crescendo when a bomb was thrown into a religious procession heading into a church in Barcelona. And in response to this bombing, whose authorship has still to this day not been definitively proven. We don't know for sure who did it. The Spanish state arrested somewhere between 400 and 800 people without evidence that they were part of this. They used it as an opportunity to arrest anti-clericals and people who hadn't baptized their children and Republicans and workers. This is their chance to kind of do a cleanup, so to speak, of the undesirables in society. And it was different because of the scale of the repression. It was also different because this is the first time that people outside of anarchist circles started to give a shit about what happened to anarchists, because it was affecting so many other people, because it started to raise questions about how the Spanish state functions, its judicial system. And as I talk about in the book later on, in the context of the Spanish loss in the War of 1898 with the United States, loss of its remaining overseas colonial possessions of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. A lot of people were asking, like, okay, this it looks like this country is going down the shitter. How do we make it better? What are the reasons why it is failing? And one of the reasons that comes out of this is because it's so quote unquote inquisitorial and stuck in a bygone era. And so, in that sense, this campaign gets a lot of attention and becomes a point of focus for all these different political grievances and political issues that are plaguing the country. Mm-hmm. The other thing to throw in is that the campaign is successful. Other than the people who are executed by the Spanish government, the transnational campaign does get the prisoners out, and this model of forming sort of seemingly apolitical broad coalitions with other social movements and other parties and forces becomes, I argue, a kind of model that anarchists in Spain use over the next decade for several more successful campaigns to get out anarchist prisoners who had, in some cases, been in there for a short time, and other cases had been in prison for like several decades.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the fortress. It is a fortress, yeah.
Yeah, Montjuich Castle.
How do you say it? Montjuich?
Montjuich.
Sure. Yeah. So also the trials surrounding this. What was this? Like what would you call it? A fortress prison? I mean, it's a.
Yeah.
This is where horrors were met out against these anarchist prisoners that became quite public, circulated around in circles, including circles that were now being called intellectual circles, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And of course, this also brought in people that are more interested in state power, reformers, etc., into a situation where they were supporting anarchists against like an authoritarian and violent sort of regime. So what went down at Montjuich?
Yeah, Montjuich,
and what were like? How did these groups see what was happening? Like, what were their explanations for it? That is to say, on the anarchist side, but also on sides that supported the state in general.
Sure. So if you go to Barcelona today, the castle's still sitting there. You can go in and walk around and take a little tour of it. It's on a kind of a small mountain overlooking the city. The Olympic Village in '92, when the Olympics were in Barcelona, was up there near the castle. And so, it doesn't have the same kind of ominous impression that it did back in the day, but it was created. I don't remember exactly when it was created. My guess is sometime in like the 18th century or whatever, as a military installation protecting the city from the sea. But it became a prison, really. And the kind of dividing line between the police and the military in Spain was not as clear as maybe it would be, at least in theory, in the United States today, as far as jurisdictional and so forth. So it was kind of this military prison, but not for military offenses per se, although that's another can of worms. But when the Corpus Christi bombing occurred in 1896, they arrested so many people that they were starting to run out of places to put them, which seems maybe surprising from the vantage point of just the massive penitentiaries that exist today in the U.S. and elsewhere, that they would run out of space. But they filled up all the prisons in the city. They even had to start just housing prisoners on random ships in the Mediterranean. Wow. And so Montjuich, though, came to be distinguished within that realm as the place where the most quote unquote serious, dangerous offenders were sent. And there were a series of cells in the dungeon of Montjuich where some of the prisoners of interest were subjected to a kind of uniform regimen of torture, where for somewhere between 5 and 8 or 9 days, they would be sleep deprived, forced to walk around in circles, beaten, not given sufficient water, given only dried cod to eat, which of course, if you don't have enough water, is the worst thing that you'd be given to eat. Yeah. Genital mutilation, things done to toenails, really awful stuff. And the purpose of that was largely to fabricate a conspiracy to get the prisoners to confess to specific aspects of this conspiracy, of maybe fabricating the materials used to make the bomb or what have you. And after a while, everyone broke. Some of them were anarchists, some of them were not. And and then some of the main people that were charged in this conspiracy were executed in the kind of what was at one point the moat outside the castle, even though it wasn't filled with water anymore, right? That they were gunned down. And this castle came to be a symbol of what was called the revival of the Inquisition in Spain. This castle came to be internationally known as this symbol of quote unquote backwardness. Then if you fast forward to the case of the Catalan anarchist pedagogue Francisco Ferrer, who was executed in 1909, he was executed there too. And then with Franco and the Spanish Civil War, when Franco won, a lot of the Spanish Republican prisoners were imprisoned there. A key Catalan politician was executed there. And if you go there today, there's a mass grave to the victims of Franquismo right near there. There are this kind of beautiful and morbid cemetery of like International Brigade deaths and so forth. It's sort of its legacy has lived on beyond that, but that's what it was at the time. Yeah. And so you also asked me, Fritz, what this meant, like what this repression meant to anarchists and other political factions. If you read what anarchists were writing, they weren't surprised by any of it because it had already happened to a lesser degree in response to other anarchist bombings, real or imagined, over the previous decades. Their view of the Spanish state was pretty clear, and they knew that it was capable of anything. And so when the first rumors of torture from Montjuich in 1896 started to trickle out, the anarchist newspapers say it started again. The defenders of the Spanish state, which were initially almost all other political factions because they considered anarchist bombings to be this kind of inhuman depravity, was just to basically deny that anything was wrong and say that the state was defending civilization. Over time, this started to change. And what I think is kind of interesting is that the rhetoric that the state used to dehumanize anarchists, that they are no better than animals or worse than animals, that they are threatening to return society to the era of barbarity, was essentially the same rhetoric that the campaign started to use against the state once evidence of torture started to circulate. That no, in fact, it is torture that threatens to undo civilization. And from our modern vantage point of understanding all of the kinds of messed up and colonial and racist histories of notions of civilization and notions of modernity and so forth and so on, there's a lot of shortcomings in how the anarchists and their allies went about talking about this. So, you see these prominent anarchists saying that what they're doing in Montjuich is the same as what quote unquote African savages do in the jungles. Like you're like, okay, like you can see that this is a product of its time. And it's important not to wear rose-colored glasses when reading about any historical subjects. So that was definitely there. But that's how the campaign unfolded, and as I mentioned earlier, it was successful.
So the book mentions also that Spanish anarchists felt and expressed solidarity with natives and blacks in the United States, and then later in the story we see like Filipino anti-colonial figures enjoying mutual aid in these really harsh conditions. So, I mean, this is a really broad scope of solidarity. It's essentially global, more or less, and it seems kind of on its face to preclude a nationalist approach. But of course, we're also talking about the anti-imperialist struggle, which often takes the form of nationalism. So how did these kind of turn of the century anarchists approach nationalism, especially in like an anti-imperialist context? Yeah,
I mean, for this history, it's Cuba is the country that matters the most in those kinds of examples, because there's an ongoing war, anti-colonial war, a nationalist war in the 1890s for an independent Cuba to kick Spain out. And it gets very brutal. The notorious General Weyler creates what were called reconcentration or concentration camps. Both terms were used. So for listeners who don't know, well before the Nazis, Europeans were using concentration camps in Africa, the Americas, and so forth. And hundreds of thousands of people died. There are horrifying images of mountains of bones and so forth. So there was this anti-imperial war going on. And there were some anarchists who were a part of it in Cuba. There were plenty of anarchists who had different takes on it in Europe and elsewhere. And I think that like this is probably a bit of a mild overgeneralization, but I think throughout different histories of anarchist engagement with questions of national liberation, you kind of get three main takes. You know, on the one end, you get nationalism is always awful and a kind of fiction created by the ruling classes to divide the workers. So we reject anything that has anything to do with it, and it's always bad forever. And we need, you know, social revolution and class war. On the other hand, you know, the other end in the context of Cuba and so forth are anarchists who essentially argue that this is a freedom struggle, so let's just support it. And then, of course, you get the sort of a middle area of like anarchists who try to thread the rhetorical needle of saying, we support the workers in this struggle. We don't support the ruling class who are nationalists, and sort of try to kind of have their cake and eat it too. Mm-hmm. You know, and in the context of Cuba, it seems to me that in Spain and particularly in France, most anarchists were somewhat supportive to some extent or another. That they realized, they believed that Spain was this monstrous imperial power that everyday people were resisting, and had a kind of a hope that maybe through this struggle, something resembling a social revolution could emerge. There are some really good books on anarchism in Cuba during the era where they flesh out in more detail that the varying perspectives that Cuban and other anarchists had on it. And it really did span the range of those three perspectives. But going back for a moment to the Montjuich campaign against the Spanish state's repression and torture of anarchists and their allies, the campaign did attempt to merge protest against Spanish atrocities at home and abroad into a kind of unified campaign. And you see a lot of the anarchist speakers drawing upon Cuban resistance, Filipino resistance, and so forth. And in France, the Cuba Libre campaign was really big as well. And there were these interesting connections between representatives of the Cuban revolutionary movement and the anarchist movement interacting, allegedly planning assassinations and so forth. So and on another thing, just to throw in, although I have not read nearly as much about it, similar debates were happening in Korea with the anti-imperial movement there as well in the early 20th century. And there's some interesting books about that too. So it wasn't only there, but that's my general sense, is that for the most part, anarchists were sort of supportive or critically supportive of the Cuban independence movement.
Mm-hmm. And as I recall, anarchism also traveled to the Philippines through mutual imprisonment as well. Maybe a mention about that might be interesting.
Yeah. So there was also an anti-imperial revolutionary movement in the Philippines, because for listeners who don't remember the kind of colonial history, Spain was controlling the Philippines as well. That's where the term Philippines come from King Felipe and so forth. And the Spanish colonial authorities sent a bunch of these revolutionary prisoners to prisons in Spain and in Barcelona. So some of them ended up in Montjuich, in some of the other some of the other prisons, sharing cells with Spanish revolutionaries. And of course, if you're stuck in a cell together, you have all the time in the world to chat. And some of these Filipinos learned for the first time about the theories of anarchism and Marxism and so forth, and in some cases brought back what some believe to be the first Marxist and anarchist texts in Filipino history because of these interactions. And after a while, Spanish authorities became aware of this and just stopped sending the Filipinos to prisons in Spain because they were concerned about this cross-pollination, which led to the creation of some of the first big kind of syndicalist labor federations in the Philippines and the organizing of big strikes. And the Spanish anarchists organized like clothing drives for the Filipino prisoners who were particularly cold in a climate they weren't familiar with, and had their families bring in clothing to give to them. And so there's unfortunately not a lot of primary sources about their interactions. I wrote this in part based on a few autobiographies and so forth. But yeah, that connection and that solidarity certainly existed. And it goes to show you how much of a really transnational movement this was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess it didn't really cross the Spanish state's mind at the time that, maybe taking these revolutionaries from one place and locking them in a cell with some revolutionaries in another place wouldn't lead to, something happening.
Yeah, I mean, while we're talking about things that the Spanish state did that were in retrospect really poor decisions, was also their kind of pre-modern notion of just deporting radicals.
Right. Yes.
So
this is a bit funny in the book.
Yeah. So as a point of context, the Russian state was much more savvy and had more experience by the late 19th century. They were spending a lot of money and creating a kind of transnational apparatus to track down Russian dissidents in France, in Switzerland, and elsewhere. Fabricating criminal charges against them or creating fake opposition newspapers. They had this broad scope of trying to keep their dissidents under their control and tracking them down wherever they want. Mm-hmm. At the same time, Spain, when they arrest all these prisoners and they're clogging up their prisons, they don't have the resources, they say, let's just ship them to England or drop them across the border in France. And then, out of sight, out of mind. It reminds me a little bit of like, if there's a little kid who has made a mess and they just sort of push it under the carpet or something, right? Yeah. But what happens, of course, is that these people, these radicals, these anarchists, when they're sent abroad, that's when the campaign actually starts to get going, is because they gain a sympathetic ear in Britain or France. The local press can actually directly interview people, can see the scars in their bodies, can get to know them. And then the Spanish government officials are like, oops, that was a terrible idea. It's funny, the assumptions that one might make about how a state would deal with this don't always track on, in part because states had to learn these things sometimes the hard way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. And you end up with crazy scenes too. I don't remember who it was now, but you had one of our main characters traveled to the UK to be met by an adoring crowd chanting "God Save the Queen" to him.
Yeah. Well, so Joan Montseny is one of the main figures in the book, right? And he and his wife Teresa Magnier, they co-edited La Revista Blanca and some of these other main anarchist periodicals of the era. Montseny published like 50 novels and novellas, really prolific. But they're probably best known for being the parents of Federica Montseny, who becomes one of the main CNT figures during the Spanish Revolution and so forth, and the first woman government minister in Spanish history, which is ironic for being an anarchist. So he's deported. He's a Montjuich prisoner. He doesn't end up getting tortured, apart from the torture that is imprisonment. And he gets sent to London. He's never been there before, doesn't speak English. And when he first gets off the boat, they're trying to communicate with the workers that they've met. And there's like a cop who speaks Spanish and starts translating for them. And they're just totally weirded out about this really nice, friendly cop who's trying to tell them about the city, where to go, what to do. They don't really know how to handle this. And then they're brought to this hall where they're given food and they're hanging out and celebrating. And beyond the language, you can always use music, right? Music sort of, even if you don't know the words, it transcends language. So the Catalans are singing their songs, and the British workers start singing God Save the Queen. And the Spanish anarchists are just so weirded out in this strange land where the police are nice and where the workers are patriotic, and they don't really know what to make of it. And they kind of really like it. It's sort of like a relaxing waiting room for them. Like, they're really exhausted. They're like, you know what, this is fine for a while. People are being nice to us. They're giving us food. But then after a little while, they just get so bored. They get so bored. You read all these memoirs of French or Spanish or Italian anarchists or radicals who are in London at the turn of the 20th century. And it's like nice to a point because they're not really being harassed. But what was it? I think it was Kropotkin who said something like, better a French grave than like this purgatory of living in London. So so they all end up leaving after a while. Part of it is, to be fair, also because it's hard for them to get a decent job. Even trained Catalans and Spaniards who had skills, professions like electrician or whatever, weren't taken seriously as being competent in England, so they would go back. But for a while, it's useful for the campaign, largely because the press becomes sympathetic at this point. And that's, you read these telegrams from Spanish ambassadors in London who are just aghast at the notion of these mainstream British periodicals being like, yeah, looks like the Spanish state has been pretty shitty recently.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that ties into my next question too, which is one of the more kind of unexpected contributions of this book is that it is, apart from being a contribution to like anarchist history, it's also a contribution to the history of human rights. And I suppose it was surprising, not so much in the sense that, the universality of human rights claims definitely fit like longstanding interests in the concept of humanity that, are very central to anarchism. So in that sense, it does make sense. But on the other hand, also, we associate human rights more with liberal discourse of state protections,
sure.
Things like that. So what did anarchists mean when they talked about human rights? And
right.
Like, from where did they come? And how did they see their relationship to, I guess, classical liberalism?
Yeah. So my point of departure with this was the kind of present day anarchist revulsion at liberal discourse and classical liberalism. And also, I think the like common anarchist defensiveness in relation to like orthodox Marxists who call anarchists like just a bunch of liberals or whatever, right? Like it's just like anarchists are like, no, like whatever, we're for revolution, like forget about the liberals. So like there's a kind of a disconnect there, particularly when it's become the notion that like anarchism is a kind of radical liberalism as charged by Marxists is this kind of stinging critique or whatever, or at least that's how they intend it. But what my dissertation advisor, Tema Kaplan, who is one of the more influential historians of Spanish anarchism written in English, she wrote this influential book in the 70s, Anarchist of Andalusia, which I'd recommend to listeners, which was influential in part because of her gender analysis, but also because it was one of the early books in English to take seriously the political strategies of Andalusian anarchists and not just sort of ascribe their whole way of being to a kind of religious millenarian fervor, the way that Eric Hobsbawm and some other Marxist historians would credit. So when I got into grad school, she was talking to me about like thinking through these campaigns in terms of the history of human rights. And I think because of these political debates that I mentioned, I was a little reluctant at first to give that a thought. But then I actually read these newspapers, read these memoirs, read these, manifestos that anarchists are writing at the time. And number one, they talk about rights all the time. They talk about rights all the time. Even it doesn't matter if they're insurrectionaries or they're unionists or something in between. They talk about rights all the time in a way that, again, present day radicals, I think, are much more critical of the notion of rights as a framework to thinking about justice. But back then it was very common. And of course, they didn't think about these rights in terms of the established laws of states. They thought about them in terms of what they considered to be natural or universal rights that transcended laws made by man. And the other thing that's interesting is that a number of these anarchists of the late 19th century essentially considered themselves and their movement to be the true legitimate heirs of liberalism. They believed that the liberals of the era had actually abandoned their own values by turning to the state, and that the true legacy of individual rights, individualism, et cetera, was in anarchism, which did not, from their vantage point, limit them, restrict them, confine them to the organized violence of the state. So what you see is that a lot of these anarchists, and of course there were some who saw things a bit differently because anarchists have a variety of opinions, but overwhelmingly the perspective was that the fundamental basis of anarchism is thinking through the broad range of natural, equal, universal rights that human beings ought to be afforded in a just society, if only the hierarchical dominance of the state and capital and church could be eradicated. And so in these campaigns, that's the language that they're using. And moreover, they're tapping into these networks of liberal, what you might call proto-human rights campaigners, like the Society of the Friends of Russian Freedom, which existed in Western Europe and the US, and were advocating for essentially kind of like parliamentary democracy in Russia. They collaborated with them. They had a lot of overlapping membership, and other kinds of campaigners, people who were involved in early animal rights movements or what have you. Now, for the few listeners who have a kind of more scholarly interest in the history of human rights, the term is usually associated with, if not the era of the United Nations, then the era of Amnesty International in the 70s. And in that sense, I'm certainly not arguing that what the anarchists did, like, created those later moments. It didn't. Those things emerged from different precedents. But my sort of more meta claim is that the history of rights universalism is broader than what has sort of narrowly been confined within the realm of human rights as understood primarily through the lenses of the United Nations and Amnesty International. And that when you expand outward to see the kinds of rights universalism that were being advocated by anarchists during this era, you can see how, in a certain sense, modern day liberals have kind of hijacked the notion that this history is only theirs. Because it isn't. Now, of course, I'm not arguing that anarchists or similarly minded people today should simply resurrect the discourse of this era. I am not at all. It's a product of its times. It has its limitations, but more fundamentally, I'm just arguing that it existed and that it changes our view of the history of rights universalism if we include it.
Yeah, I actually had no idea about any of that. Really.
I mean,
you see that kind of language, but yeah, I hadn't really thought about it.
Even if you read like Galliani or someone like that, he talks about rights, and I think it just tweaks our understanding of not only what anarchism was about, but also like where they got their ideas from and who they were looking to as sort of like fundamental sources of intellectual influence.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a hard turn then from the high-minded discourse to the sort of reactionary violence, I guess, would be maybe a personal judgment on it. But let's talk about Émile Henry, who was a guy, again, that I was fascinated with when I was a younger fella. You know, there's no innocent bourgeoisie. I was like, yeah, fuck me. You know, and I'm just sitting there at a fucking Starbucks waiting for it to go off, you know? But yeah, so who was Émile? What did he do? And let's talk a little bit about his, I guess, interpretation of class warfare, because it wasn't just his, obviously. He was connected to a lot of other people and figures, but I think he's a very kind of dramatic point to start with, maybe.
Well, I mean, not only fuck you, but fuck him, right? I mean, he came from a kind of a bourgeois background as well, right? Which is sort of maybe a paradox of that story. So Émile Henry was an anarchist, a French anarchist in the early 1890s, who is best known for two bombings. The first was in the context of a labor dispute. He left a bomb outside the office of a mining company, and this is like one of the most important things to remember with a lot of these bombings where the person didn't do it in person, is that it's always like the working class person who ends up engaging with the bomb, right? When the Gallianisti were sending letter bombs to rich people, it was usually the servants who'd open them up and get their hands blown off, not the rich people. But anyway, he leaves this bomb outside the mining office. The clerk comes out. It's this big pot with like some sort of gas oozing out of it. And he's like, this is weird. He called the police. The police brought it to the police station, and it blew up in the police station, killing a bunch of cops, but also the delivery boy and some clerical staff. And so Henri was happy with that outcome. For him, it was, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, right?
I mean, he upgraded from outside an office to inside a police station.
It was the mining company office, right? So he wanted to blow up this mining company because they were the bad capitalists in this labor dispute. So then when that happened, he wasn't directly implicated, but he fled from France to England and was sort of laying low, except he wasn't. Like, he was bragging about what he did to the anarchists in London, most of whom didn't really believe him. And then he came back to France, and he was really inspired by some of the similar bombings that had happened in Spain, because so in part, this is a transnational story of anarchists influencing each other across borders. And he decided that he wanted to take revenge against the bourgeoisie as a class, as a whole. And so he he made a bomb. He was walking around in one of the more upper class Parisian neighborhoods and was looking for a really crowded place of bourgeois sociability. And he found one at Cafe Terminus, and he went in. He had a dinner. I think he smoked a cigar or something. He wasn't planning on paying, of course. And then he got up, and as he was leaving, he threw the bomb, which exploded, and ran away. But he was tracked down by authorities and arrested, eventually executed. And as you mentioned, his justification was there are no innocent bourgeoisie, which is a similar claim to what was made by Santiago Salvador, the Spanish anarchist that influenced him when he threw a bomb into a theater in Barcelona, right? So again, it's sort of attack on what they perceived to be a class. Now, both of these, so the general anarchist take on these bombings was on the negative end. There were some who thought that this was the way to go, but like Charles Mulatto, prominent French anarchist, argued that Henri's bombing damaged anarchism first and foremost, more than anything else, because these are people who were just trying to have a drink and go to bed at night. Certainly, there is something to be said about spaces of class identity being a little bit more fixed then than today. For the most part, but certainly it's not the kind of attack that got widespread societal approval or widespread anarchist approval. In contrast, the assassination of a head of state or something like that without any collateral damage is something that got much more societal approval. And Henri, when he was in prison, he wrote a manifesto about what anarchism meant to him, and you can Google it online and read it. It's kind of an interesting historical document, but that was his story. I
mean, I was actually gonna ask you kind of touch on this subject earlier, because the Corpus Christi bombing is one of these kind of more indiscriminate acts, right, of propaganda of the deed, as opposed to like these assassinations of heads of state and the like. So I'd imagine that it also had a kind of similar response among like the milieu, like people not too excited about killing some random people. Although I guess they were probably mostly church people, right, or churchgoers.
With the bombing of the cafe or the theater, the claim could be made to some extent that they were targeting spaces of bourgeois sociability, and that's not necessarily a good idea, but like there's something to be said about that. That could be said less of the church procession bombing, because what happened was the bomb was set off at the tail end of the procession where all the everyday people were marching, and not at the front where the important politicians and generals were marching. So because that was what happened, anarchists of the era generally argued that the Corpus Christi bombing was a police provocation. Police provocation. It seems in retrospect more likely that the anarchists just fucked up, that he missed time setting off the bomb, because it wasn't a bomb that was thrown. It was a bomb, it seems, that had a fuse, and so you had the time when it went off and probably set the fuse too late. The procession went farther along than he imagined, and he ended up blowing up everyday people, because it seems likely that it was a French anarchist who did it. And according to the testimony of some anarchists of the era, after he set off this bomb, he fled to England, I believe it was, and asked a bunch of anarchists, "Oh shit, I did this thing. A lot of people are getting arrested and tortured and stuff. What should I do?" And they told him, "Turn yourself in so that these people can get out of prison." He didn't like that advice, so he fled to Mexico. That's the story that some anarchists have told. We don't know if it's true, but there's reasonable amount of evidence to believe it. But I read a scholar of what's called critical terrorism studies. And as an aside, I'm not a fan of using the term terrorism, but we can talk about that if you're curious. And he described those kinds of bombings like the theater or the cafe as being strategically indiscriminate, which means that it's indiscriminate within what is perceived as a certain demographic, right? So it's not just anyone, it's what they perceive to be the bourgeoisie, but is indiscriminate within that sort of sphere. I think it's a helpful little framework for thinking about those kinds of attacks.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about the other side of that coin. which would be the development of kind of criminology around this, policing and stuff like this. So your book mentions that France's anthropometric criminology department developed specifically around Henri and his case. Yeah, is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that his case like made it happen, but it was during that era, and he was one of the earlier people to be subjected to that kind of analysis.
Okay. So he was more of an early case for them rather than like okay. And what in general then, what can we say about how propaganda of the deed and so on affected policing and its development in this period? And I guess the ultimate question, it's a little simple, too simple, but in the end, did these actions have any other effect other than strengthening the police state, as far as just looking at how states develop, not so much the popular interpretations, not so much like support or not support, but
because propaganda by the deed particularly, but anarchism in general, was viewed by people in important positions in society as being outside of the sphere of politics and a kind of insane criminality, which is how they would usually view it. It was particularly relevant for the developing fields of criminology. And so you have figures like Cesare Lombroso, the Italian criminologist, who were trying to theorize a kind of an anarchist type, who were trying, this is overlapping with eugenics and quote unquote race science and social Darwinism, thinking about what is it about these people that made them turn out as these kind of like murderous psychos, as they would view them. And the kind of things that like Lombroso and a lot of his peers were liberals in a sense, who argued that it was society's fault that these people turn out this way. I mean, their solution wasn't exactly like, let's have full communism, but they did want a more equitable society that had better sort of hygienic conditions for people to not turn out this way, and were sympathetic to notions that it was the condition of the working class that led people to this, right? So it wasn't just that they thought people were strictly insane without any context, but they have these familiar depictions of the analyzing the skulls of anarchists, analyzing their features, and this overlapped with what the state would do as far as their records on people who had been arrested, including like diagrams of their hands with where scars are and the lengths of the fingers. And part of it was identification, part of it was sort of this criminological analysis. And I do think that the anarchist movement, I mean, it's hard to disentangle the influence of anarchism from the broader workers' movement in general, but certainly during this era, the notion of preventative policing rather than simply kind of reactionary in the literal sense of reacting policing started to gain more ground. And one of the pioneering examples was this guy Le Pen in Paris. But certainly you can see even in Spain that with this era of propaganda by the deed, particularly in the 1890s, they started to think, okay, like maybe we should actually keep records of all anarchists that live in the country, right? Which is seems like an obvious idea. Maybe we should collaborate more with foreign governments to monitor anarchists who come and go. Part of the problem with the Spanish police in general was that whenever the local political officials would change party, they would fire all of the heads of the police and replace them with new people. So that there'd be institutional turnover every few years in the police department. And the cops were so underpaid that they would take side jobs. And it was very unprofessional by our standards. Most of them were rather illiterate, and the only training they received was a big manual that they were largely unable to read. And even if they could, were unmotivated to read. So the propaganda by the deed did motivate a lot of professionalization of the police force, record keeping, the usage of like more quote unquote scientific methods of analyzing prisoners and so forth. Certainly there's a lot to be said about protection of heads of state and key politicians because of the threat of propaganda by the deed, because when the Spanish prime minister was assassinated by an anarchist in 1897, the security forces were completely incapable of preventing it. They put out a really poor showing. So the general view I would say is that it did push professionalization, what might sort of loosely be called professionalization, enhanced use of kind of scientific and other innovative forms of analysis of prisoners, record keeping, preventative policing. And in the case of Britain, it pushed them to close their borders more because they were, along with, I suppose, Switzerland, the country that you'd go to in Western Europe if you were fleeing Russia or Italy or Spain.
Yeah, right.
And after a while, that was taken advantage of so much that the Britain started to kind of implement more and more restrictions to migration, in part also because the Spanish government would just send ships of prisoners to Britain without the consent of the British government, which they weren't too happy about. So that's the general trend. Now, as far as like what impact did propaganda by the deed have on the state, other than that, I mean, I simply, for the most part, it really just made the state better able to stop propaganda by the deed.
Sure.
You know, I mean, that's the real takeaway. You know, you can get into conversations around specific acts which were more or less conducive to this or that or the other. Like the assassination of Prime Minister Cánovas del Castillo is probably the most successful example of propaganda by the deed that I know of, because it accomplished its task. It didn't have any collateral damage. No one else was harmed. And the guy who replaced him followed drastically different policies. You know, propaganda by the deed makes sense to the degree that the person who is targeted, that their absence would make things different, you know, and in that case, it did have somewhat of a difference. And you would have to wonder also what might have been the case if they had managed to take out the King of Spain, which didn't succeed because there was this kind of simmering Republican movement. Who knows, maybe we would have gotten a Spanish Civil War before the one that ended up coming in the 30s, but we'll never know.
All right. So also on the subject of policing and state strategies, we've talked about it a bit, but the specter of the agent provocateur, or as they say in France, the probably agent provocateur.
Sounds good.
Does that sound right? All right. But yeah, I mean, it's the idea of it. The specter is there in a lot of these stories. The question about was it the state? Was it some covert op or not? It sounds like, you know, this has been also very useful as an idea in the trials of some of the characters in this book. At least like building a sense of uncertainty at the very least about whether or not somebody might have blown someone up. But what would you say is the reality of covert operations in this time of agent provocateurs and stuff like that? You mentioned sort of the Russian intelligence network being more effective than anyone else, I guess, at the time. Did other states also adopt that model?
It seems so. So like, well, I briefly mentioned that one of the first anarchist newspapers in France to be like super pro dynamite was like a newspaper created by the police.
Oh,
you know, because well, first of all, it basically, they wanted to kind of, it was sort of like what's the term, like a honeypot, right? They kind of wanted to attract all of the flies, quote unquote, of people who would be into that, and so that they could, And in the context of Spain, we do know that there were infiltrators. There was this one funny case of a police infiltrator in an anarchist group in Barcelona, because like nudism was kind of a thing in anarchist circles at the time.
Yes.
And so was like spending time in nature. So there was this anarchist group that's like, we're going to go to the beach and all hang out naked on the beach. And the infiltrator's like, I did it, but it was awful. And I felt so uncomfortable.
There you go. That's how you weed them out.
Yeah, right. So, you know, it was a thing. It was also like probably just as it is today, was more of a rhetorical specter than anything else, because anytime anything happened, there was a debate of like, is this something done by a principled comrade? Is it something done by a provocateur? Is it something just done by the police? Like, who's taking responsibility? And there were some cases in this history where anarchists who didn't like the action would say it was done by a provocateur, even if they didn't believe it, just as a way to kind of push back politically.
Of course.
Yeah, right.
This also makes me think of one of the more strange incidents, which I originally had an entire chapter on, but the publisher made me cut because I was running out of space in the book, about this Catalan figure called Joan Rull, or Joan Rull, I guess is the Catalan pronunciation, but for the purpose of my poor pronunciation, I'm just going to use the kind of anglicized name of Rull. He was this anarchist in like 1905 Barcelona, who got arrested, charged with some stuff, and made a deal with the authorities to be an informant. He's an informant for a while, and he tries to get more and more money out of the Barcelona government by claiming that if you give me money, I'll give you the information you need so that there'll be no bombings in the city. And after a while, the governor kind of wanted to pinch pennies and said, I'm cutting you off, like your information isn't helpful. So he and his crew started planting bombs, setting them off in order to go back to the governor and say, you see, without paying me, these bombs are going to go off. And it worked, right? He got back on the payroll. And essentially it became a kind of business where he got money, he got some of his family paid, they gave him an apartment, which became kind of a gambling pad for him and his family and friends. It became this industry of like, we won't plant bombs as long as you pay us. Eventually, he got caught. He got executed with his other family members. But this is sort of when the internal logic of propaganda by the deed as an anarchist strategy really hit its low point during this era, because it's something that even if you were an anarchist in favor of this strategy, its public signification had disappeared, because these bombs that these like, I guess propaganda by the deed entrepreneurs were setting off, they were setting them off in markets, on the street, like completely indiscriminate, in public restrooms, which were a new thing in Barcelona at the time. So that's when, that's not the only reason, but that's when you kind of get this stronger shift within Catalan anarchism towards revolutionary syndicalism, and they create Solidaridad Obrera, which is the predecessor to the C&T and so forth. But yeah, there were provocateurs. We'll never really know exactly how many of them there were, whether some anarchists were getting money on the side or not, or informing or not. But it's as long as there's a kind of incentive for the state to do it, it's going to happen.
Sure, yeah.
I guess then also on the state level, outside of policing, how did sort of the network of European states respond to all this? Not necessarily from humanitarian outrage, but in protecting their own interests and class positions and so on. So I guess we're talking about shoring up borders, like in the case of the UK, maybe the anti-anarchist laws, that sort of thing. Yeah,
both. Well, a lot of countries had passed laws against crimes committed with explosives in the 1880s and 1890s. A lot of countries. Spain and France, both in the early 1890s, passed specifically anti-anarchist laws, which were increasingly more repressive over time, that made it, in the context of Spain, illegal to publish anarchist newspapers, to have anarchist political centers, and so forth and so on. And the backlash that emerged from the Montjuich campaign against state repression made it so that the government was reluctant to renew these laws, and it sort of created more political space for anarchists to operate. But in 1898, there was an international anti-anarchist conference in Rome, which brought together most of the European powers. The United States was sort of part of it, but like didn't really care. Being sort of like isolationist and so forth, about creating international accords for the repression of anarchism. And none of the potential or actual decisions by the conference were actually binding to any of the member states. So it really kind of was more symbolic than anything. But it's an interesting historical example, because on the one hand, you get states like Russia, who had a vested interest in labeling as anarchist any kind of dissident anything, to have an excuse to create an apparatus of repression that would paint with a broad brush. And this is a time when Russia is to some extent concerned about its international reputation and so forth. And so if it can be part of this broad crusade against anarchism, it makes them look better. And on the other hand, you have like Britain, who the British representative says, like, if there's a crime, we're going to prosecute. If there's no crime, we won't. It doesn't matter what the politics are of the criminal. And some perspectives in between. And connected to that is like, how do you define what an anarchist is? Overall, like the specific Congress didn't really have any meaningful impact, but you can see it as a kind of stepping stone towards what would eventually become Interpol, but you that didn't happen at this point. Really, the changes that actually happened were more at a national level or at the level of like 2 or 3 specific states collaborating, sharing information. Like the French state collaborated a lot with Spain, and the best surveillance of the Spanish anarchist movement, particularly in Barcelona, was done by French government agents who in their internal correspondence would just talk about how completely inept the Spaniards were at monitoring anarchists. So I did a lot of research in Paris to look at what Spanish anarchists were doing.
Well, that's a fun excuse to go to Paris.
Yeah, can't complain.
Yeah. What was his name again? Joan Rule?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know if he had to pay taxes on his federal money he got as
I
a
do not
agent there?
know, although I would guess not. And even if he had to, he wouldn't have paid them anyway.
So,
this is for a little gem for our listeners, because we were talking about one of these FBI informants, Nazis, who also got in trouble for not paying taxes on the money he got from the FBI.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, actually, if any listeners, if you want to hear about it, it's going to be our next Patreon episode. Partially, we'll mention it. Yeah. So that feels so far away, boys. Is this not nice? Listeners to the show, regular listeners, isn't it nice? We were asked once, like, when are you guys going to talk about somebody you like? Like, it does feel like a little vacation, doesn't it?
It's also kind of, considering how fascism has become such a big deal, particularly in recent years, to talk about an era where, at least in a formal sense, there was no fascism.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. The air is different somehow, isn't it? It's a little fresher.
But the thing though, is you can see a lot of the seeds of it, even in this stuff. Like it's there if you know what to look for, which is you know.
Yeah. This slow inward turning of colonial oppression, I guess.
Or even like how some of the like French Republican supporters of the Montjuich campaign were anti-Dreyfusards and anti-Semites. And seeing so.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of these figures. Sadly, it would be literally impossible to talk about all of them. But again, you've done a really good job of like taking a lot of these figures that, again, in my reckless youth, I was deeply fascinated by, but also frustrated about, because most of the texts that were easy to find about a lot of these people were extremely romanticized. Your book does a really good job of toning that down without necessarily sacrificing how very interesting these people really were. And I'm talking about guys like Vaillant, who I believe was the one that blew up a nail bomb in Parliament. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. We have like the sort of anarchist celebrity Robin Hood type Ravachol. Mateo Morale, who I believe was the guy that did he stick a bomb in a bouquet? Was that dude?
Yeah, tried to blow up the king and his
tried to blow up the king.
Yep.
On their wedding procession. Am I wrong?
Yeah, coming home from their wedding. Yeah, that's a way to ruin a wedding.
There you go. Yeah, it did. And then so these guys.
You kind of wonder, as an aside, this is a stupid comment, but you kind of wonder, like, if maybe there were some aspects of the wedding that one or the other of them were feeling kind of shitty about, like the floral arrangements, or like, like the in-laws had said something really mean. But then the bomb goes off, and then like none of that matters.
Thank God. Look, I know it's horrible to say that, but thank God.
Otherwise, when they got home, what one of them wasn't going to hear the end of it from the other one.
Oh yeah. His fucking uncle was going to give a toast, and everybody was dreading it.
Yeah. Pros and cons.
So you're saying that it was Morale was also an op set up by
by a really really super professional party planner.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Oh man, awesome. I would definitely see a J-Lo movie about that, which is a wedding planner reference to anybody who. Yeah, Ray, did you get that one?
No.
Okay, just curious. All right, watch it. It's gold. It's 90s gold. All right, so Yeah, what are we talking about? Not J-Lo. But these guys, yeah, so they're, these sort of martyrs.
Often
as they were called.
romanticized martyrs of anarchists.
Yeah.
By the deed, yeah.
Yeah. And in the end, of course, the actual effect they had was questionable, we'll say, to negative. But maybe we could focus a bit on Ravachol and who was it, because this guy really took up a lot of space in people's hearts and minds at the time, as well as the book. Very popular mystique kind of cult following to this guy. What did Ravachol mean to the movement?
Yeah.
Who was he?
Who was Ravachol? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Ravachol was a French anarchist in the early 1890s who is best known for attempting but failing to blow up a prosecutor and a judge on two separate occasions, and then was subsequently arrested, largely because after his bombings, he went to a restaurant, was really chatty with his waiter.
Yes.
The waiter said, he matches the description the police have put out. And then shortly thereafter, he comes back to the same restaurant, has the same waiter, and then they call the police and he's arrested. And anarchists of the era thought that was such an incredibly dumb way to get arrested that they didn't believe it was actually him. They're like, that guy wouldn't have done that. And he did.
Yeah.
He was arrested doing that. He had, anarchists had a lower estimation of him prior to some of these bombings because he had murdered a wealthy old man and stolen a bunch of his money.
Right. Yes.
And he had tried to rob a grave, but there was nothing of value in the grave. So stuff that just not exactly what anarchists are putting forward as the way towards social revolution at the time.
Yeah, right.
And
generally frowned upon.
Even his
comes up a couple times though in this book.
Yeah, even his attempted bombings. Even if you were sympathetic to the specific targets, the way that he and his comrades went about it was they went into the buildings where the judge and the prosecutor lived. They didn't know which apartment they lived in, so they said, all right, let's just set the bomb off in the middle of the building somewhere, and hopefully it'll get them.
Yeah.
It's just such a bad idea. And on neither occasion did they get the target. In one case, the guy wasn't home. In the other case, he lived just on the other end of the building. I don't even understand why they would think that would be, even just on the level of trying to actually succeed, why that would be a good idea.
I mean, how hard would it be to find out?
You just have to have some patience. Maybe you surveil the building. It's not like these judges and prosecutors had any sort of armed guards. It's not like they were really worried about anything. It wouldn't have been that hard if you just had some patience and put some man hours into it. Not to use a gendered phrase, right? But that's the phrase that's often used. And so it's just really weird. And as far as the impression that anarchists had of it, I mean, there were of course more unionist anarchists who thought that the use of dynamite was a terrible idea, but to a large extent, most anarchists thought that Ravachol was pretty great. That he sacrificed himself, that he took the risks, that he was basically going to keep on attacking the state or the bourgeoisie until he succumbed.
Kind of.
Yeah, right. Even though he was really bad at doing it.
Yeah.
And I argue in the book that he became a kind of model for propaganda by the deed that was taken up by a number of other anarchists. So Paulino Payas, who threw a bomb into a procession, a military procession in Barcelona shortly thereafter, he had helped to edit a newspaper in France called Ravachol, right? So the connections are very obvious. And I think also when we're talking about the legacy of this propaganda by the deed, it's also kind of interesting to think about how some of this was kind of maybe a little tongue-in-cheek taken up again by the era of May 68, because there was a song of that era about the police station that Émile Henry blew up, and also one of the sort of more famous communiques from the young radicals of the era was Committee for the Revival of Ravachol or whatever, right? So it's kind of lived on, and I think that you tell me what you think about Eastern European anarchists, but in my experience in Spain, it seems like there's a bit more of a kind of, I don't know if homage is the right word, but at least a kind of recognition that figures like Ravachol or Mateo Moral are part of the family, and that even if we don't agree with what they did, they're our comrades, and so if you don't like it, you can go fuck off. Whereas in the United States, for the most part, it's just completely distancing for the most part, most anarchists distance themselves completely from propaganda by the end at all. So what's your take about Eastern Europe?
I think historically it was kind of similar, like what you mentioned, to Western Europe. I saw in some old Balkan anarchist newspapers from the beginning of the 20th century that Ravachol is kind of mentioned as an anarchist martyr, and this was in an anarchist communist, also kind of syndicalist newspaper.
But I was talking about like today.
Today.
Well, I don't mean necessarily like Eastern European propagandists by the day. I mean like, what is the Eastern European anarchist sort of memory of that era? Because, like, for example, I have a poster of the 2010 Barcelona Anarchist Book Fair, and it has all these different logos. It has like a circle A, it has a fist, and then it has an Orsini bomb, which was like the bomb of the 1890s that the anarchists used. And I didn't know nearly as much about any of this back 12 years ago when I got that poster, but I was like, oh shit, like you would never see an American anarchist book fair put like this historical bomb associated with propaganda by the deed on their poster, right? It's a completely different kind of historical memory of what that meant. And it took me back, and I've learned a lot about it. So I was wondering if in Eastern Europe there's a similar kind of, not necessarily glamorization, but like this is part of who our milieu has been, and we like recognize it and sort of embrace it.
I think in the Balkans, anarchist people who kind of refer to such things usually don't use so much Western European examples.
Okay,
I think an example they refer to always is Gavrilo Princip and his assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Like, for example, that's something that a lot of anarchists have like a positive view of, although, Princip was even a nationalist who kind of had sympathies towards anarchism, but explicitly really rejected it. So that's one thing that comes to mind as like anarchist people have, tattoos of Gavrilo Princip and T-shirts and so on.
Tattoos, that's intense.
Yeah.
Well, he's also revered by nationalists as well.
Which is partly why that strikes me as a little weird.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is a little weird. Yeah. I remember actually hearing something. This Ray, you might recall this when we were talking to a comrade from Greece a long time ago. We were talking. There was a conversation about like certain kind of more militant things that were happening in Greece and some of the armed struggle stuff. And this guy said something really funny, and I'm definitely paraphrasing it now because this was years ago. But he was like, but the anarchists, they don't use the gun. We're for the bomb. And that all stuck in my head as like, wow, okay, so.
Well, back in the day, they used both, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was more referring to like the kind of, I don't know, urban guerrilla style,
sure.
Armed struggle. And was more in favor, of course, of the bomb.
All right. So I think, Mark, it's about time that you introduce somebody that you've got, let's say, a strong connection with. Let's say intellectually. You've done some work on this guy, Francisco Ferrer.
Yeah.
Ferrer,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's a favorite of mine.
Is he?
Kind of all around anarchist dude, But he's also one of these guys that had his feet in sort of all camps of the time around the question of propaganda of the deed, it sounds like. I mean, he was involved in mutual aid and educational theory. He was, if I'm not mistaken, a Mason, or at least quite tight with Masons.
He was like a very high-ranking Freemason, yeah.
There you go. Yeah. But he was also very supportive of the insurrectionary sort of propaganda of the deed camp, some figures in particular. He sort of strikes me as your quintessential all-around 19th century anarchist guy, turn of the century, rather.
Yeah.
So can you introduce Ferrer,
Sure.
fit him into this period, maybe connect him to condoms, which was a surprise for me to see.
Everything from bombs to condoms and in between.
Everything from bombs to condoms. Bombs, schools, and condoms. He's basically every current Republican's worst nightmare. and
the equivalent right-wing nightmare back then, right? So,
yeah, sure.
Francisco Ferrer was the founder of the Modern School in Barcelona in 1901, which was a school that was very ahead of its time in a number of ways, being co-educational, focused on science and rationalism rather than religion, which is, big deal in the context of Spain
So ahead of our time too.
Well, yeah, increasingly so, right? And he publicly denied that he was an anarchist. Privately, he was, if not an anarchist, pretty close to being an anarchist. And he, as you mentioned, had his foot in, or hand, or whatever body part, in all sorts of what the anarchists were up to during this era. So apart from radical education, he privately funded the Anti-Authoritarian Labor Federation, wrote theory pieces on the general strike, on revolutionary violence. He was a neo-Malthusian, which was big in some anarchist circles. Not all anarchists agree with it, but was essentially a movement that pushed for birth control, sex education. It did have a bit of a eugenicist streak to it, but the focus was largely around birth control. And so like figures like Emma Goldman were active with it. So he and some of his comrades helped organize some of the early sex ed presentations or contraception presentations in Spain. And he was allegedly, I think he actually was, but it's not definitively proven, part of a plan to assassinate the king of Spain. Well, he was allegedly part of two attempts to assassinate the king of Spain in 1905 and 1906. There's more evidence to suggest his involvement in 1906. And so you talk about him in relation to propaganda by the deed. There's no evidence that he was sort of like one of those anarchists who argued that the bomb is always the answer. But he sort of held on to, in his youth, he was a Republican. And he never fully got rid of that politics, I think it's clear to say. And so the notion that getting the king out of the way, getting rid of the monarchy would open up space for new political possibilities was something that he seemed to have held on to his entire life. And so he was allegedly part of this conspiracy in 1906 with some radical Republicans, with some anarchists, to assassinate the king of Spain, to create some sort of a kind of lefty republic, and then possibly push it even farther towards being, an anarchist, communist kind of society. Now, most anarchists of the era would not have thought that was like the way to move forward. The notion of kind of like a transition phase or whatever, or let's do the republic first, we'll do anarchy later, was not how the vast majority of anarchists during that or any other era have talked about it. But he was this guy that sort of had his politics were a bit of a buffet, a little of this, a little of that, and that's how we saw it. And he was allegedly part of this conspiracy where Matteo Morral, who was the editor of the Modern School publishing house, threw a bomb at the royal couple, as we talked about, likely ruining, possibly slightly improving their wedding day.
Ruining or saving their wedding. History's out on that.
We don't have evidence about any potential marital spats that alleviated.
Could have prevented.
Yeah. So but he was arrested for his alleged role in that assassination attempt, was ultimately not convicted, which was surprising, and his Freemason connections were said to have helped in that regard. But he's most well known for being accused of having been the mastermind behind the tragic wheat revolt of July into August of 1909, which was essentially an uprising against conscription for a colonial war in Morocco that became an anti-clerical kind of rebellion that saw the arson and looting of a number of churches and other Catholic institutions. And there is no evidence that he was the mastermind behind that, although he very much wished he could have been. And so he was executed for that. And the kind of campaign that developed in support of Ferrer was bigger than any of these other campaigns you've discussed, and really became a big deal across particularly Europe, the Americas, and North Africa.
Yeah. I'm curious, actually, how this mobilization against conscription turned into an anti-clerical
good question
phenomenon.
Well, part of it was that the ships that were being used to transport the soldiers from Barcelona to Morocco were owned by this guy, this aristocrat who was had very strong connections with the Jesuits. Part of it was also that there was just long-standing anti-clericalism among the Barcelona working class for a variety of reasons. And so when sort of there was a vacuum in state presence, that became a target. Now there's scholarly debate about the degree to which the Radical Republican Party orchestrated a campaign of arsons. It seems like, I mean, maybe that wasn't as important as some scholars think, but it certainly seems to have happened to some extent. Part of it was spontaneous, part of it was planned. There's also the kind of speculation that the Radical Republicans, who talked a bigger game than they wanted to walk, wanted to divert, because originally it was a general strike against conscription, organized in large part by this anti-authoritarian labor federation. And so there's some sort of conspiracy theories, which by calling it a conspiracy theory, it makes it sound farcical or like unrealistic, but it may have actually happened to some extent that some people in positions of power within the Radical Republican Party wanted to kind of encourage this anti-clerical safety valve rather than taking on the state and potentially getting their leaders in hotter water than they wanted to handle. But anyway, if you read the book, you can kind of get into some of the ins and outs of all of that. Now, that one of the strangest parts that happens with this anti-clerical insurrection is that a lot of these anti-clerical rioters disinter the bodies of clergy, particularly nuns, take the corpses out of the coffins and display them around the city, particularly in front of the homes of rich people, and sometimes parade them through the city.
Damn.
So there are these photos.
Although ostensibly there was some reason for that, right?
Yeah.
That the idea was that they were initially trying to look for evidence of physical abuse that it had been rumored that the priests and so on were engaging in.
Yeah. So there was this long-standing notion in anti-clerical circles that many nuns had been coerced into the clergy and that they had been abused once they were there. And of course, part of this is kind of, you might say in retrospect, a kind of patriarchal notion that these women couldn't have made their own decisions. But nevertheless, these were the legends, and they were looking for evidence to say, you see, this is what we've been talking about. Part of it, of course, I'm sure was also just a kind of a fuck you to the clergy, because like what more devastating thing could you do to the clergy as a body of people than dig up their graves? That's like pretty hardcore.
That's pretty strong.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where you go after that.
Yeah. So that and there are these really graphic. Well, I mean, graphic insofar as the bodies are very decayed, right? It's not like they're recently deceased people, but graphic images of people lining up with these bodies. And what I think is also kind of interesting is that it's clear that people are like, when there's an opportunity to get in the photo with the bodies, a lot of people like get in, like, we're like, yeah, hey, I'm a part of this too. Which shows, how curious people were about photography, but also that like, there wasn't this perception that they might be in hot shit for doing this.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the connection between how did this become an anti-clerical rising has to do with the specific connections between the Jesuits and the war, and this longer standing anti-clericalism, which had this kind of element of rumors about the mistreatment of women, and also about the fact that essentially the church ran a number of businesses under the auspices of kind of giving work to down people that were hard in hard times, and that they didn't like have to pay taxes and they underpaid the workers. So these were kind of artisanal ventures that were competed with independent artisans who were kind of like, here's my opportunity to burn down the competition. So there's a lot of kind of factors that converge to make this happen.
Wow, yeah, no, I just can't get that image out of my head. It's like a death metal album cover, like people posing with like a decaying nun. I mean, that's
yeah. To all the American right wingers out there now concerned with the protests in the streets, just remember
it could be worse.
It could be worse. Yeah, Jane's Revenge isn't fucking disinterring nuns, dragging them to people's houses and taking pictures with them. So keep that in mind.
And it is kind of interesting while we're a little bit on current events, like in the US, obviously the overturning of Roe v. Wade has brought the question of, the role of those religious institutions that are anti-choice into the public discourse. And there have been some protests at churches. There have been some like vandalism of churches and other religious institutions that are anti-choice. But I think it'll be interesting to see over the coming years how much the left and the reproductive rights movement will actually directly engage with those religious institutions that are, patriarchal and are anti-choice, because that wouldn't have been, that engagement, I think, gives a lot of American leftists, makes them queasy in a way that Europeans can't fully understand, I think. But that wouldn't have been an issue back in the day with these Spaniards who consider the church to be like enemy number one.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and even, with the phenomenon of like modern schools and libertarian schooling, it's much also, like you mentioned, is giving a secular education. That was also true in the United States when they were also doing experiments with modern schools, right? Is that, as an alternative to going to Sunday school and having that being kind of one of your only forms of education.
Right. Yeah. And even socialists did like socialist Sunday schools back in the day in the US.
Right.
And there was a debate between Marxists and anarchists in the early 20th century about what to do regarding education. And a lot of Marxists argued like you make the public schools better, you work within the system, you try to, and then anarchists saying that you can never trust the state to educate children, you have to make your own independent schools. And at least in the United States, like there's no more real substantive anarchist argument that like we need to create our own schools. It's just not really feasible at this point, I would say, for the most part. And then there's the whole issue of like charter schools, and it gets like complicated and so forth. But that was a debate back then.
Yeah. It's obviously the situation's quite different now, because you have like this kind of push for charter schools and getting rid of public education, and so like religious institutions or corporations can have greater control over education. Yeah.
But you still do have interesting debates about how anarchists should or should not engage with the question of like the welfare state. I remember I was in Spain like 10 years ago, and there were all these big demonstrations to protect the public health system. And there were two comrades from the Senate, the CNT, one arguing, like this isn't perfect, but we need to support the public health system. The other person being like, to hell with the public health system. We need to create our own system down with the state, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's interesting how, in a certain sense, if you were kind of like run-of-the-mill socialist, you could kind of acclimate yourself within this a little bit easier.
Yeah.
I have to say it was interesting having just finished your book before these protests erupted and hearing people chant "fuck the church, fuck the state" after having read about the anti-clerical uprisings and stuff.
Yeah, well, maybe there's something for people to learn.
Maybe there is. So I guess let's close it just to make our regular listenership a little more comfortable. Go back to some home territory here, and maybe end just with a word on who LaRue was. A bit about LaRueism and kind of its relationship to the story. This is a buddy of Ferrer's, but through LaRue, we end up in very comfortable territory with Franco.
Yeah.
And our listeners can breathe a sigh of relief that there is at least one fascist in this episode.
Yes. Alejandro LaRue was this Republican in late 19th century Spain who was within the world of Spanish republicanism, there were some Republicans who wanted to topple the monarchy and some who sort of wanted to acclimate themselves to the constitutional monarchy and try to work within it. And LaRue was a kind of firebrand populist demagogue who wanted to topple the monarchy. And as the 19th century turned into the 20th century, he became famous in large part through being a newspaper editor at the head of the Montjuich campaign. And so he came to be well regarded among the working class for having fought for the prisoners in Montjuich Castle. And he saw that there was kind of political currency to be gained in adopting certain elements of anarchist talking points around, elections are corrupt and we need to topple the system. And you could see some of his rhetoric had a bit of a kind of a fascistic kind of edge towards, we need like vibrant, virile young men to topple the churches of society and to the kind of what you could see kind of a proto-fascist revolutionism in a sense. And he moved to Barcelona from Madrid in the early 1901, 1902, and went back on his anti-electoralism and ran for office and won a few elections and siphoned off a lot of working class support from the anarchist movement to LaRueism, including some self-described anarchists. And his basic program during the era was this kind of radical republicanism. I mean, they called themselves radical, but how radical they were is up for debate. And a kind of authoritarian populism. So he was very much opposed to Cuban independence, for example. He was a Spanish nationalist. You have the nationalism, you have the populism, you have the glorification of violence. You have this kind of his movement was the first kind of rupture in the stale old two-party system of aristocrats. So you have this kind of using modern politics to redo society element. And then, of course, if you fast forward to the 1930s, when you have the Second Republic, he becomes a right-wing prime minister of the Spanish Republic, the one who was in charge when the socialist miners in the northern region of Asturias rise up against the state and were brutally suppressed. And he ends up being basically, I'm not sure if you could straightforwardly call him a Franquista, but basically an ally of Franco. And he lives in Franco's Spain after the war, and he writes an autobiography, which by virtue of having to write it in Franco's Spain might be a little bit unreliable as far as some of his earlier experiences when he was connected to the anarchists, but nevertheless, that's the document we have. But it is interesting to see LaRueism as one of a number of proto-fascist tendencies emerging around the world at the turn of the 20th century. And I mentioned or alluded to Henri Rochefort in France, who was the editor of L'Intransigeant, which was another radical Republican thing. And you can see in Republican circles this kind of nexus of populism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, friendships, connections with the left, but where a lot of this stuff kind of can germinate.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a lot of that before, especially in our second arc when we were talking about some of these kind of fascists in Yugoslavia and where their kind of origins, many of whom kind of came from like worker struggles or socialist milieus.
Yeah.
Or anarchists even, right?
Yeah.
D'Annunzio was a nudist too, wasn't he?
Was he into nudism?
Oh, that was his boy. That was the guy that stole the pig.
Yeah, that was the guy that stole the pig.
Yeah.
But I mean, nudism, it is funny that you mention it because when you read like old like anarchist texts from back in the day, you see how big of a role nudism had. Like I know that one of these like big intentional communities somewhere in the US like had a major split and they like, irreconcilable split and all went in separate directions over the problem of nudism. It's just like hilarious to think about today. Like some of them were like, no, look, we just really don't want to be nudists. And, like, we're having it. And
that's what's interesting, among other things about history, is, especially people who have a kind of political affinity with these historical subjects may go in thinking one thing, and you find out that what was important to them was rather significant from what you imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that happens all the time.
All right. Well, Mark, thanks again for this. I want to just give you another plug that the book is The Anarchist Inquisition, Assassins, Activists, and Martyrs in Spain and France. And we should also mention, since we talked about Ferrer, your book, Anarchist Education in the Modern School, a Francisco Ferrer reader, which I have read and is excellent.
Thank you.
So y'all should definitely check that stuff out. Any final words here before we log off?
No, it's always a pleasure to chat with you all, and I look forward to whenever the next time is.
Absolutely, man.
All right, yeah. So thanks again for being here, and check out those books. And all you guys on our Patreon are going to be in for some fucking weirdness this Friday or Saturday, whenever that comes out. So get ready for that. All right. Speaking of fucking agent provocateurs and shit, I mean, that's...
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Back to the mind melt.
Back to the mind melt, nice, the successors of the Temple of Blood. So thanks for this vacation, Mark. Really, I feel refreshed.
Always happy to help.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Right.
Bye.
See you later. Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.